Greetings and felicitations.
Hip, hip, hurrah, tally-ho.
This is the one that started them all. We're here with our good friend, Lee Red 2.
Thanks for having me, guys.
The three of us, we did rewatch the movie, Star Wars. And when we were growing up, that's what it was called. It was called Star Wars.
It was not A New Hope at first.
Within time, it became The New Hope to differentiate from the Star Wars franchise. Man, a lot of history here. Kavura and I, we watched the unaltered original version. I mean, it was taken from the Laserdisc, so it was the version that didn't even say Episode 4, A New Hope, when the crawl went through. Lee, which version did you watch in the rewatch?
I watched the DVD release. So the when it came out, probably at the time of Attack of the Clones, when Attack of the Clones was coming out.
So I imagine that was altered a bit from the original?
Yeah, unfortunately, edited version, all the way edited, re-released. But, I still have the unedited versions, but it's on VHS, so...
Oh, yeah, they're fantastic pulling out those old VHS tapes.
Somewhere in space, this may all be happening right now. 20th Century Fox and George Lucas, the man who brought you American Graffiti, now bring you an adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars.
Here they come. Coming in too fast!
The story of a boy, a girl, and a universe. It's a big, sprawling space saga of rebellion and romance. It's a spectacle, light years ahead of its time.
I am C-3PO, human cyborg relations, and this is my counterpart, R2-D2.
Hello.
No sauces, no sauces!
It's an epic of heroes.
Good luck.
And villains. And aliens from 1,000 worlds. Star Wars, 1 billion years in the making, and it's coming to your galaxy this summer.
All right, so let's take a go around and talk about our first experience with it. Now, Kavura, from what I understand, your first experience with Star Wars, you didn't see the movie first. You were exposed to it through StarPodLog magazine. How did that happen?
Well, I mean, when Star Wars came out, I was a child, and my parents just didn't take me to see movies back then. I mean, I think they just weren't interested, and certainly not in one like Star Wars. So I really didn't see this movie until after I saw The Empire Strikes Back in theaters. Mm-hmm. So it was different for me. And I did think Empire was a great movie. So when I saw Star Wars, I was excited about it. And yes, I do remember, loving Star Wars the first time I saw it.
That's awesome. How about you, Lee?
So when I was like super young, tiny, my neighbor actually had the Escape from the Death Star game. And that was my first interaction with Star Wars. And playing the game, I was, she was like, well, I've got the movie. Do you want to watch it? And from that moment on, I was hooked. So it was my first experience with Star Wars, the Escape from Death Star game, and then right into watching Star Wars and just blown away.
Now, my experience is a little bit of a combination of yours, Lee, and yours, Kavura. My absolute first exposure was when I was in kindergarten. This is how I got into KISS, and this is how I got into Star Wars, both the same way. I got into KISS because of the KISS dolls. I got into Star Wars because of the Star Wars action figures. I mean, those action figures, before Star Wars action figures, it was Mego. Everything was Mego because Mego had the license to so many popular genres. But I played with this kid's action figures, And it was the creatures that really pulled me in. Hammerhead and Snaggletooth and Greedo. Went over his house, because he lived a couple blocks away. His name was Manny. And he had the land speeder. I thought that was fantastic. I'm looking at all this stuff and these figures. And I told my grandfather, I want one too. So my first figure that I got was the Sand People. They called it Sand People, but it was one person. So you're teaching kids poor grammar right off the bat. But but then I wanted to take in everything what's the story behind these? There's no cartoon, so I got the trading card, the comic books, the storybook. Wait a second, you mean this is all a movie? And I wasn't the only one of that age group of, like you said, Kavora. My parents were going to bring me to a movie that they had no interest in. Because we went to other movies, like my father brought me to Star Trek or other movies that came out later because he was interested in it. They had no point of reference with Star Wars. But my brother and I did see it at the movie theaters. Fortunately, my brother's a deep hardcore collector, and when my grandfather passed away, he went through all my grandfather's things, like with painstaking detail. And my grandfather used to cut out the ads from newspapers back when they used to advertise upcoming movies in the newspaper. Do you remember there used to be a movie section in the paper? It was just pages and pages of movies. My brother found the actual cutout, and my grandfather would write dates down of when he took us to see it. And so he has the original cutout. So we saw it August 25th, 1979. So we saw it during the re-release. We saw it in New Haven, Connecticut at the Cine 1-2 on Middletown Avenue. And the ad is pretty funny because it says, held over, matinees daily, Star Wars, rated PG. The price of your dinner at Sofer's Barn Restaurant includes a ticket to this theater. So I don't know if we went to eat beforehand or just went to the movies. I don't remember it. My brother has a much better memory than I do. And even though he's younger than me, he remembers so many details of things of the past. I don't remember going. Obviously, we have a record of me going. But I do distinctly remember going to Empire Strikes Back. So, I mean, for all intensive purposes, as far as my memory, my first movie was Empire Strikes Back. But I ended up seeing Star Wars. We want to talk about a game changer in the science fiction realm. This is it, because it broke the formula of science fiction.
You know, and I think we've mentioned this a little bit before about how George Lucas had the idea of old space. You know, and you see that in some of the New Hope. You see that in the Mos Eisley scenes. You see that in some of the battle-worn vehicles and transports. He had a new vision of what you know. I guess it's a long time ago, but science fiction always has a feeling of being in the future. So it's just a new way of looking at it that was brilliantly done. Can I add on the action figures?
Yeah. Because I mean, that George Lucas's merchandising drew in a whole different group of people than your standard moviegoers. So what did you think about the action figures?
So, you know, and I think we discussed this a little bit with this movie. We don't need to do as much about reviews and movie stuff. It's more about personal experience. And for me, the Star Wars figures probably got me through kindergarten. I was one of those kids that my parents would drop me off and I would lose my mind crying like crazy. And the bribe that my parents came up with was that for every week I could go to kindergarten without crying, they would get me a new Star Wars toy. So that's where like most of my collection came from originally.
So it was your reward.
Yeah. Just if you could act normal for 1 week, you get this new toy. So those figures, you know, it's funny how they have a different place for each of us, I think, in the Star Wars community.
It's Darth Vader, watch out! And he's got a lightsaber.
It's Kenner's Star Wars action figures, each sold separately.
I got you now, Ben Kenobi.
With R2-D2 and C-3PO. There's even Chewbacca and Han Solo.
Someone's coming, Chewie. Who's there? It's Princess Leia and Luke Skywalker. Now I know the Force is with us.
Darth Vader, R2-D2, C-3PO, and other Kenner Star Wars action figures, each sold separately.
Well, also, we know that this movie, George Lucas, one of his things was that he wanted to base it on the old Flash Gordon serials. He wanted it to be the old style adventure, but with updated special effects and have it's called a space opera a lot of times instead of science fiction, because it's more of an adventure story and has, a lot of elements of Dune with the idea like the Bene Gesserit, the spiritual thing with the Force in Star Wars. And, it's just one of the things that made it different from, like, you know, it's also compared to something before it, like 2001, but it's much more of an adventure story, more excitement than that.
Yes, and you can tell even by the actors that he chose. He pulled some from classic cinema, but then purposely brought some newcomers in too. The idea was to have this space opera, this massive universe, if he could do it. He didn't think this would fly originally, but his idea was so big. So let's look at some of the details. Directed and written by George Lucas, produced by Gary Kurtz, starring Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, Peter Cushing, Alec Guinness, music by John Williams. Distributed by 20th Century Fox, and it was released May 25th, 1977. The budget was $11 million. The box office took in $775 million. So there's no doubt about it that it was a success. It surpassed. Now let's think about some movies of that time. You mentioned 2001. Jaws. Jaws was another massive movie that came out 2 years earlier. So it really took everyone by storm of, Lee, you mentioned it being an old universe, a weathered universe. I mean, think of the contemporary science fiction of that time. What else was out that had nothing like that with a weathered universe, right? Space 1999, everything was fresh and clean.
Right, it was. This one was, they wanted it to look old and yet be sci-fi or a fantasy that was current. But it had to have that look of being a little bit older. And
you use the term space opera. We loosely use the term sci-fi. I mean, when we spoke of it when we were younger, we call it science fiction, or oftentimes you might have heard the term speculative fiction. But George Lucas reinvented the genre. Let's talk about the article in StarPodLog magazine number 7. This came out the cover date was August of 1977. So if the cover date was August, it means it came out a couple months earlier. And this is the first time we see StarPodLog on the front page of StarPodLog, on the cover of StarPodLog magazine. It's entitled Preview of the Spectacular New Science Fiction Movie, Star Wars. It's an article by David Houston. I'd like to read some of the highlights because when we look back at this, we see how people viewed it differently and how groundbreaking this movie truly was. Star Wars is a legend ahead of itself. Prior to the film's Memorial Day premiere, the screenplay was published in the form of a Ballantine science fiction novel, on the basis of only a few released stills. The Star Wars production office was being deluged by requests, all denied, from collectors after seeing only a few completed sequences. 20th Century Fox moguls already had begun to seek a commitment for a sequel. Alan Dean Foster had completed a second story that could form the basis of such a sequel, and it had already been sold as a novel. The Making of Star Wars, an illustrated book, had already been sold and will be published this summer. The Marvel Comics version of the story had hit the stands in March and was selling well. An enormous toy and model kit deal was being finalized. There were negotiations underway for a TV series based on Star Wars. And, while all this was going on, only a handful of people had seen the movie. What is this movie? Can it possibly live up to expectations? Star Wars is a new $10 million science fantasy film made by Gary Kurtz, producer, and George Lucas, writer and director, and was released by 20th Century Fox. The story is set in another galaxy and time that concerns a valiant struggle against a totalitarian empire that is spread among the stars. The characters therein have never heard of Earth. Their alien worlds and cultures, that dress and architecture, their technology, history, and future, if any, are not of this world. Even more than was true for Star Trek and Space 1999, the universe of Star Wars is totally fabricated out of imagination. The fabricator is George Lucas. He first got the idea for Star Wars 6 years ago, around the same time he was developing what would be his first box office hit, American Graffiti. Lucas was a youngster then, not long out of film school at the University of Southern California, with only one feature to his credit, the now famous, little science fiction understatement, THX 1138. Fantasy for a New Generation. It's for young people, writer George Lucas told the New York Times, explaining why he developed the project. American Graffiti was for 16-year-olds. This is for 14-year-olds. Young people don't have a fantasy life anymore, not the way we did. All they've got is Kojak and Dirty Harry. There's all these kids running around wanting to be serial cops. Nobody except Disney makes movies for young people anymore. I want to open up the whole realm of space for them. Science fiction is okay, but it got so involved with science that it forgot the sense of adventure. I want Star Wars to make them think of things that could happen. I'd like them to say, gee, wouldn't it be great if we could go run around on Mars? Kids today seem to be having a very boring childhood. The only people we're going to offend are the die-hard science fiction people who are into the whole idea that science fiction is what Hugo Gernsback said it was, dealing only with plausible science of the future on a fictional level. Our hardware is so fantastic as to be really impossible. We're not set in the future anyhow. Our film is set in another galaxy, and it says in the credits, it's in the past. It's a fantasy film, a space fairy tale. That's why we call ourselves space fantasy and not science fiction. So right from the onset, George Lucas was making waves in the science fiction world by establishing that this was something different.
And also, he like some of it was based on the writings of Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, the idea of having a princess and then having the hero that had to rescue her, and so it was just a story like that. It had some elements of mythology as well as the Flash Gordon and things like that.
You know, and I was at a panel with George Lucas, and he mentioned one of the things he really wanted to do was to give a morality story to young people growing up. And to me, that struck such a chord because, as silly as it is, there were so many moments in my life growing up when I was younger that either I would think or my parents would even say, you know, what would Luke Skywalker do? You know, and in some ways, Star Wars embedded a generation with the idea of morals and how you treat friends and all these things that are just included in this amazing movie. You know, I look at it as the American epic because it has so much that culturally binds not only Americans, but definitely Americans and some of our historical culture too.
There was so much about Luke being the restless kid on his home planet and wanting more. So there were probably a lot of young people at the time who related to that.
I think all of us at one point were saying, there's nothing for me here where I'm living right now. I can't wait to get out of the house. I want to do things on a grander scale. I mean, that just his drive to do more touched everyone.
Burger King presents 4 bright, colorful Star Wars glasses. Hey, it's Luke Skywalker.
And the princess. Gee, wow!
Get your kids a different Star Wars glass each week. Buy a regular serving of Coke for 59 cents plus tax. Get Chewbacca. Get Darth Vader. R2-D2 and C-3PO.
What mission? What are you talking about?
We can get all 4.
Star Wars glasses at Burger King until February 2nd.
And I remember watching, like this was years after Star Wars had been out, when Siskel and Ebert, one of their shows when they were talking about it, and said that this movie was such a game changer because it had, it was one of the first sci-fi, probably the first that was aimed at teenagers. and brought out this exciting movie. And after that, there were more movies that were aimed at teenagers.
Makes sense, because quite a few science fiction previous was either very much geared towards adults, like 2001: A Space Odyssey, and then you have things that are just silly, just plain silly, that's geared towards very young people. Whereas this was the happy medium. This was made with such craftsmanship that you can grow up with it and still enjoy rewatching it. You could hit at any point of your life. I'm amazed when I meet people that are retired, that they saw it when they were in their 20s and they loved it.
It's amazing. And the levels, you spoke of like how I think wherever you're at in life and your understanding of life, you can find a story in Star Wars that you can relate to. And the more I watch it and the older I get, the deeper the stories are. Throwaway lines that are in this movie that, can only take up 2 seconds of screen time, as you get older can really relate back to or allude to emotions and ideas and things that, you didn't quite get when you were younger. So to say Star Wars ages well is an understatement for sure.
Even with the, they did the remastered version, but even the original still holds up, and the special effects still look good. You can still see how they're fitting for the movie, and you don't really even see it as something that's made a long time ago, that it's 40 years old now.
And that's one of the things that he was groundbreaking in, developing a team of people who are on the cutting edge of technology, but also it wasn't just the visual, it was the sound. You look at the sound department, and they were creating unique sounds for TIE fighters, for Chewbacca's roar, for the lightsabers. I mean, these were sounds that we've never heard before, that were developed strictly for this film, that he thought was going to be a flop. If you want to talk about any movie that's a labor of love, this is it.
And how crazy is it now that if we had our eyes closed and somebody played a recording of a TIE fighter going by, we would know immediately what it was. Something that has never existed, and it's just in our brains. We all know a lightsaber lighting up. Everybody knows what it is, and it's never existed, which is just mind-blowing, really, to think about.
And Lucas created his own special effects team for this, Industrial Light and Magic. They were created before the movie just to make the special effects for this movie.
And I like the fact that the StarLog article established how George Lucas was not making science fiction, because science fiction previous to that, growing up Star Trek fans, you look at there's science that makes sense in Star Trek. This was right off the bat. Science is, as we know it, is non-existent. You cannot have two suns that close together and have a planet flourish. So you have to have, when you're young, you don't think about that. When you're older, the Star Wars universe has made us not look at the scientific value of it. That the science value, this is a galaxy far, far away. They have different laws of physics from us, and we accept that.
And it also influenced other shows that came on, like not even like a 1 year later, Battlestar Galactica and Space Academy on Saturday mornings, and the Star Trek movie. Star Trek existed before this, but they were going to make a new TV series, but because of Star Wars, they made the Star Trek the Motion Picture.
You're not kidding. Can you imagine a world? There's a Marvel comic series that's been out for decades, What If? And all it does is it takes one piece of the Marvel history and switches it around, and it shows how everything would be different. Well, what if? What if Star Wars did not make it in our world? Can you imagine how different our lives would be? How many movies can we say that would literally change our life?
And this was the start of all those, yes.
Well, and then think about to continue on that theme, the way Star Wars broke the special effects and changed special effects. I don't think you have a Forrest Gump, just totally different genre, totally different movie.
Yeah.
But just to show you the ripple effects, I don't think Forrest Gump happens without Star Wars.
Because it had the visual effects, having, let's see, in Forrest Gump, like showing Elvis Presley right next to the kid Forrest Gump. I mean, things like that. I mean, yeah, it brought technology forward, definitely.
And it's funny because George Lucas, he didn't believe this would be a success. He didn't even attend the world premiere of it because he was quite frankly embarrassed. He thought it would be a failure. So him and Steven Spielberg, which was his friend at the time, they were early friends, they went on vacation in Hawaii and they started drafting up the ideas for Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Interesting.
I guess that didn't work either, right?
No, I don't think so.
But do you remember that time period, late 70s, early 80s? If you heard the names George Lucas or Steven Spielberg, or especially the two of them combined, you knew that it was going to be fantastic. I mean, they were the hit team.
Yeah, Raiders of the Lost Ark was, their first project together, which was huge.
E.T.
Yes. And yes, Spielberg doing E.T. and Close Encounters, which came out at about this time. Mm-hmm. Yes.
You know, and I think too, like the difference in then and now is, those creators had such a hold on it that although they had a feel of their movies, each movie was completely different. Nowadays, you know, with the overarching owners of titles and so forth, it's more blueprint, it's more formulaic, and it just, you know, as much as I love the Marvel movies, they come out and they're basically very similar. But with George Lucas and Spielberg, it was like each movie had its own feel, which is pretty special.
Kenner proudly presents Star Wars Electronic Battle Command, the computerized space battle game.
Enemy scan on. I see you. Battle stations.
Red alert.
Star Wars Electronic Battle Command has computer scanners, force units, invisible shields.
Fire!
3 levels of play, basic, intermediate, and advanced.
My TIE fighter's hit.
Hey, Dad, let's play the basic game. You always get carried away.
Star Wars Electronic Battle Command from Kenner.
We look at how this hit the world with gangbusters and how those involved didn't think it would be such a big deal. I mean, George Lucas didn't show up for the premiere. James Earl Jones did not want it to be credited because he thought it was just going to be a joke and it would hurt his career. So if you look at the original cuts, it doesn't say voice of Darth Vader by James Earl Jones. The original credits are kind of strange. We followed them when we watched it intently, and like normal, it says the big stars' names: Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, yada yada, and then it says Anthony Daniels, Kenny Baker, Peter Mayhew, and then 2 other names that we didn't recognize, and we were like, okay, who are these other people that are named? And it was the lead Jawa was one of them. Remember that? Wasn't it?
Yeah, because, well, you kind of think it's because, like, these guys didn't wind up doing cons later, but, you know.
So, I guess not headlining credits, but sublining credits to the lead Jawa, which I thought was curious. Put him in the same vein as Anthony Daniels and Kenny Baker. I mean, Lee, you're a big autograph hound for Star Wars personalities. What were some of your favorite experiences meeting, especially the core players from this movie?
Oh man, so the 3 that stick out with me the most is, you know, I'm getting ready to meet Carrie Fisher, and I've got a poster that's got all the original cast that's still, you know, that's living, with the exception of like Alec Guinness, who passed away, and Harrison Ford, I think, are really the only 2 big ones that I don't have. And as I'm walking up, Carrie, being Carrie, takes 2 handfuls of glitter and just glitter bombs this guy standing right in front of me. And as great as it was, I'm like, oh my God, my poster, you know, like, it is an awesome moment. That was cool. When I met Mark Hamill, I couldn't speak. Anthony Daniels was interesting because he actually chewed me out. And initially, as he's sitting there yelling at me, I just started smiling because I was like, man, that's R2-D2, like, or I'm sorry, that's C-3PO chewing me out because I was standing over the lawn. You know, I think most people may be upset, but I was really just geeked out that I'm getting yelled at by C-3PO. And of course, the R2-D2 signing was
I want to strangle you. I want to
right.
strangle you, because remember we were supposed to be spending so much time together at Celebration, and you're like, I can't. I'm still in line for Kenny Baker. I'm like, what's the deal with this Kenny Baker line? I mean, it's amazing how popular he was as a celebrity.
Yeah, and I think too, it's one of those things where, it's. I think most people were aware that we were getting to the end of our opportunity, and as we unfortunately witnessed, some people I think took a little bit of advantage of that. But I'm glad that I stood in line. I hated that I was missing so much, but glad that I got that autograph.
But look at the experience you have now. I mean, you've met some awesome people in line, you said, and all these things that happen to you in meeting these celebrities. It's priceless, and they are. The Star Wars cast isn't surviving to the extent of some other major franchises, which is kind of shocking in a way.
Yeah, I think for different reasons. You think about like how their cast, like Peter Mayhew and Kenny Baker, and their stature. I think physical stature puts different strains and things on their bodies, and so. Their life expectancy may be a little bit different. And then we have the tragic loss of Carrie and the things that she lived through. But, we're if you're looking, there's not that many of the original cast, unfortunately, that I think you can still have an opportunity to meet now. If Harrison Ford just happens to come across this and wants to meet up, I'll gladly do so.
Even back in the 90s when I met David Prowse, and this was at a con I was at the con dance on Saturday night, and David Prowse was there sitting in the audience, and I asked him if he was going to dance, and he showed me that he had these braces on his feet. He said, "Well, I can't dance anymore." And I was like, "Oh, sorry,"
Mm-hmm.
But he was a nice guy. He was really nice to talk to. So yeah, it is great meeting these people when you get a chance.
Definitely. It's like, they say don't meet your heroes, but I've had nothing but amazing experiences meeting every single one of the Star Wars cast that I've had the pleasure to. And unfortunately, it would have been interesting to meet like Peter Cushing or Alec Guinness to talk about Star Wars, knowing how they felt about it during the time. I've heard some awesome stories, like supposedly Peter Cushing wouldn't wear shoes on set.
I know, isn't that funny? And there's some cosplayers that actually walk around and cosplay with slippers.
That's awesome. And, and Alec Guinness had some absolute bona fides on his resume. He was in some big movies going into it, and I don't think he was as thrilled about being in Star Wars as some of the others.
And that's another thing that you mentioned. It's Alec Guinness and Peter Cushing, because when I was younger, we would refer to Obi-Wan Kenobi as either Ben Kenobi or Obi-Wan Kenobi. Whereas my grandfather, because he brought us to watch all the Star Wars movies, he didn't know the characters' names, he only knew the actors' names. So when it came time to get the Ben Kenobi figure, he'd go, "Oh, that's Alec Guinness. Oh, look, yeah, like everything was
the Alec Guinness figure."
Yeah, exactly. He knew him. So they were pretty smart of getting someone from a previous generation to relate to it, because now when we watch the current Star Wars movies, I feel like I'm my grandfather. Like, I don't even know the new Star Wars movies character names. I just know the actors' names because of other movies and TV shows that they're in. So, I mean, that formula and that cycle keeps going on.
Man, that's a great point. And then to think about also the roles of both of those characters, Obi-Wan and Tarkin, and the actors giving that connection to the older generation watching it. That's a great point I've never even thought of.
Well, and George Lucas did say that he did want to cast unknowns for Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia, but for Obi-Wan Kenobi, it had to be someone with more experience as an actor. He actually wanted a veteran actor for that part. So that is one reason he got Alec Guinness.
Yeah, he needed to have somebody that could carry some weight. And I think his presence, I didn't know who Alec Guinness was when I first started watching the movie, but he has a presence on screen, and I think that character needed something like that.
And we're talking about casting. The the big three there, Luke, Han, and Leia, they were cast in groups. So it wasn't like he cast Harrison Ford and then cast Gary Fisher and then Mark Hamill. The purpose was to see how groups of three would interconnect with each other. Now, can you imagine if one of them didn't have the chemistry to work with the others, that there could have been not just another Han Solo, there would have been another Han, another Luke, and another Leia. How crazy is that?
Yeah, that boggles the mind.
That's blasphemy. That's blasphemy. I don't even want to think about that.
Darth Vader apparently was the first character that George Lucas created for the movie. And again, I'm going to go back to my childhood because I truly love the visual look of Star Wars. Of all the things that I collected as a kid or really enjoyed as a kid, when it came down to Star Wars, visually, that was king. And my mother got me these plates, these how could I say it? They weren't necessarily posters. They came in a fold. It was a portfolio. It was called the Art of Star Wars Portfolio by Ralph Mcquarrie. And I was obsessed with looking at them. And it was the ideas that Ralph Mcquarrie had that he submitted for the movie. So it had Luke with an aqua lung on him fighting Darth Vader. It had stormtroopers with shields and lightsabers. So, I mean, the original script for Star Wars was very different than what we got to see. But it was still very visually stunning on so many levels. Lee, how did the visual of Star Wars affect you when you first saw it?
You know, I had a similar fashion. I had a storybook that had R2-D2 and C-3PO on the cover that I can still visualize. You know, of course, I've seen it since then, but just the looks, the colors. I still say, you know, when somebody asks me what my favorite color is, it's lightsaber green. You know, there's in the blues of the lightsabers. It's the look of things that came from somebody's imagination, and you know, with Ralph and with George, it's just remarkable. And Darth Vader's look and the colors of the lightsabers and the way that they just nailed space. Like I don't, no other sci-fi movie or no other movie set in space to me captures the grandness of space the way that Star Wars has.
The like the dogfights in space and going into hyperdrive, the way they did those visual effects was really awesome.
It's just going from Bert's sound engineering to the visual effects to everything. The ability to make something imaginary becomes so realized and so realistic, and like I mentioned earlier, we can close our eyes and all of us can recognize the sounds, the sight. So if we open our eyes, we could recognize the sight. Something that came from imagination that's never really been made, but still real to so many of us. It's remarkable. And
for Darth Vader, also the breathing sound, and I mean that was one of his trademarks. Oh, yeah. But the whole idea of Darth Vader, he became the quintessential villain for everything, for sci-fi, or anytime you think of a villain, you always think of Darth Vader.
Yeah, I had a pair of light blue underoos with Darth Vader.
I had that. Yeah. They were great. I distinctly remember being frustrated because we got the first set of underoos I ever had was Captain America. Because at that time, it's funny, we're deviating a bit, but when we think about the merchandising of Star Wars, it was like no other. So the first underoos I ever got, it was Captain America. But when they had it was early 80s, because by this time Empire Strikes Back was out. My brother was obsessed with Boba Fett. My main character, when my mother would buy his stuff, was Darth Vader, and from that point forward, my brother always got Boba Fett stuff. So he had the Boba Fett underoos, which looked like the plate armor of Boba Fett, but the Darth Vader underoos wasn't the plate armor of Darth Vader. It was just a picture of Darth Vader. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
What's up with that?
You can experience the Force again in Star Wars.
Here they come. Coming too fast.
The original, legendary Star Wars is back. The most popular film of all time, Star Wars. Coming back to your galaxy for 2 weeks only. Star Wars, rated PG. The Force will be with you in just 3 days.
We were talking about the sound of Star Wars. What about the soundtrack? John Williams' score?
Just genius. Can I tell? Speaking of the sound of Star Wars and John Williams, another cool personal moment for me is at the ICC convention last year. My band was actually playing, and my violinist started playing the Cantina song, and a gentleman came up that was actually an actor in the scene and was like, "Hey, I was the spaceman in that scene," and actually signed the picture, brought a picture out for us, signed it for the band, and gave it to us, which was an incredible moment for us. It's hard to recover and keep playing, but the music in Star Wars, I don't think it's if you remove one of the puzzle pieces, the sounds of the TIE fighters, Chewbacca, lightsaber, the looks of the lightsabers, the actors that are in it, and then especially John Williams, if you remove any of those puzzle pieces, it's just not the same.
Yes, no doubt about it. And he revolutionized soundtracks for movies.
Yeah, that was another thing that this movie did as a first, that the grand theme music and the whole soundtrack was just wonderful. And it sort of it set the stage for other movies to have these wonderful soundtracks.
And another thing that was a first that was unique, that it did not have credits at the beginning. You were immersed in the universe immediately through the sound, through the sights. You didn't feel that you were watching a bunch of actors. This was a historical record of sorts.
Yeah, and they got fined for that too, correct?
George Lucas did. Yeah, George Lucas, he bit the bullet, and because that's the way he needed to tell his story.
I think he made his money back.
Oh, yeah. And another thing about the money too, didn't they say the actors they signed contracts to get a lump sum of money for this movie because no one really expected it to make that much. But then when it did make a lot of money, and George Lucas made all this money from it, he actually gave some money back to the actors. He compensated them because he just made so much. And then I was reading, I think it was in StarPodLog years later, there was an interview with William Shatner where he said that George Lucas is the only person he'd heard of in Hollywood that actually said, well, we made a lot of money, so here's some for you, because he was that much of a nice guy.
Mm-hmm. George Lucas is known for how he gives back to the community.
It's also goes to how just his business savvy is also. His decision, I believe he sold some rights to obtain rights to the merchandising. Gave some money up to get merchandising rights and so forth. That to have that type of foresight that obviously paid off dividends. So a good guy, smart guy that did a lot of good.
And when it comes to business sense, I mean, re-releasing the movies for another generation in the 90s was a stroke of genius. As much as we were frustrated that there were changes made, part of it wasn't his fault. Let's go back to who shot first. I mean, that was something because the Motion Picture Association of America, when reviewing the movie, the standards for the time of 1977 to the 90s have changed. And in order for the movie to maintain a PG rating instead of a PG-13 rating, Greedo would have to shoot first, and then Han would have to retaliate. So it's interesting how the standards of rating systems for movies have changed and how it affects the re-releases and if it was worth changing things, because George wanted this to be for young people when he re-released it in the 90s. And a whole new wave of action figures. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have the massive fan base that's there now.
Han shot first. That's become such an expression that the fans use now.
What other expressions have come out of this movie?
A lot of the lines from the movie, these aren't the droids you're looking for. Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper?
What is it? We don't serve your kind here.
Yes.
May the Force be with you. I mean, nothing's bigger than that. I remember seeing those buttons and wanting them. That seemed to be like the things that teenagers wore during that time period, where Frodo lives and may the Force be with you. It was like a trendy thing.
Well, I still say it today, so it stuck with me.
What about I have a bad feeling about this?
Oh, yeah. Which is what the second most common phrase in Star Wars, right?
Sure is.
Yes.
What do you think about the designs of the ships? We got a chance to meet Colin Cantwell some years ago at a convention, and he was talking about the Millennium Falcon was originally supposed to be longer and have more of a cone-shaped front. And then Space 1999 was released, and George Lucas said, "Whoa, we got to scrap this. The Millennium Falcon can't be long now." And he looked at his hamburger, and a hamburger had an olive stuck out to the side, and said, "This looks good. Let's go forward with this idea." I mean, how? Again, alternate universe. What if George Lucas didn't see Space 1999? What if the Millennium Falcon was a long ship instead of the one that we absolutely love right now?
Man, and I think it goes back to what you said earlier. His decision to not be science-driven and to be more fiction-driven and to be more fantasy-driven, which opened up for some of these remarkable, visually stunning pictures. To me, a TIE fighter makes no sense whatsoever, but it's so awesome. It's just amazing. And I think his ability to separate and not get so tied down with being scientifically accurate allowed for some of those designs in the space shuttles and spaceships and Death Stars and Millennium Falcons and X-Wings and TIE fighters.
I think that the Millennium Falcon is like the only ship we've seen that's asymmetrical. It had something different on the right and the left. They didn't look the same, which was, it was unique, and it was just fun to look at. And they made fun of the ship too, a piece of junk and all that.
Yeah, I love the lore of the Millennium Falcon and the way, and as you mentioned, the way they make fun of it, and then his braggadocious ways of talking about some of the stories about it. The ship is an integral character, for sure.
And when we think about the ships and how we'd mentioned how they're all weathered, and Han says, "You haven't heard of the Millennium Falcon?" We are essentially watching a movie that has a history behind it. When we see the opening scroll, there's a history behind this movie. That in itself was groundbreaking, because how many movies start as an origin story? So even though George Lucas thought that this potentially could be the end, he wanted to tell his story. He was hopeful that there would be more. I mean, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, that book was supposed to be the idea of a movie if they were going to have a sequel, because it has just a few characters in there. He figured he could hire Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher again. He couldn't hire everyone else. That's a story for another discussion of Splinter of the Mind's Eye and what would happen if this was a failure. But George had a built-in mechanism for making prequels. But if it didn't work, we would still watch this movie knowing that this was an amazing universe, that we're just seeing a sliver of it.
I think that's part of the beauty in it, and I think that's a lot of the part of the disappointment for a lot of people when they actually watch the prequels and the things that people have trouble getting over, because George Lucas wrote a story that allowed you to write into it. We were able to make up our own backstories for a lot of these characters and a lot of these ideas, and have the mystery and the wonder. Wonder is probably the best word for it. You know, we had to fill in the blanks, which made a amazing movie that just was bigger than just what they put on screen.
This is Jim Shooter. Whenever I feel like hearing about comic books, I listen to StarPodLog.
And I think that's why the comic series was so incredible. That's one of the first comics that I ever remember having, are the early Star Wars comics. There was a handful of comics when on the other segments of the StarPodLog podcast when we talk about comic books. I mean, that was part of the reason why I was drawn to Marvel Comics was because of Star Wars. And when we had a discussion with Jim Shooter last year at a comic convention, he was editing those comics. He said literally Star Wars comic books saved Marvel Comics. Marvel was on the verge of bankruptcy. But because of that comic book, now this is something that is unprecedented now, would never happen. The comics came out before the movie. So if you were slightly interested in Star Wars and was wondering what all the buzz was about, you could start reading the comics before the movie came out. The novel came out before the movie. I mean, that would never happen now. Ever. Because the movie always comes out first and everything is spoiler free. But those comics were amazing because it expanded the Star Wars universe. It showed what the possibilities could be. It showed what the possibilities for Luke's past could be, what other character developments there could be. When we talk about the expanded universe during that time period of the 70s, I'd have to say they were firing on all cylinders and did an amazing job of world building.
I think, when we get into the 80s, we see some of that in other franchises that start developing also. The blueprint of G.I. Joe and Transformers and He-Man, I think a lot of that ties back to Star Wars. How they had the action figures, the comics, the movie, just a hit on merchandising in all fronts.
Let me ask you, do you think Star Wars would be as popular of a movie if they didn't have the merchandising machine behind them?
No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't for me. Those toys, you can't separate the two. But it made it to where I was obsessed. Most movies, if it was just a movie, you watch it for 2 hours, you think about it. But for me, because of those toys, you watch the movie, and then you go and you sit there and you play with the toys for the time in between until you get to watch the movie again. So it really drove Star Wars into an obsession for me as a young, at a young age.
And I remember, having the Star Wars storybook, having the Star Wars album. I have to give John Williams credit as me having a true love for classical music. My grandparents listened to a lot of classical and a lot of opera. It wasn't until I got that Star Wars soundtrack and you open the gatefold cover, and I remember bringing it to show and tell and being so proud, opening the gatefold and looking at all those pictures. I didn't have a reference point because I didn't see the movie. So the trading cards, the storybook, anything that I could get my hands on, I was able to piece together what this movie was like. And so the merchandising helped tell the story so much so even before I saw the movie. And if you look at the Star Wars storybook, it has the edited scenes there where Biggs was on Tatooine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's a history in Star Wars of the merchandising actually being where we're introduced to ideas and characters. If it's Fett being introduced in the animated series, the idea of the Obi-Wan Kenobi Anakin fight actually being brought out in the novel, I believe, first, and so you mentioned the Biggs on Tatooine. Still, there's all these things where the merchandise builds on the universe that's there. So to answer the question, yeah, I do not think it's would have been the same without it.
And we look around our house, like where we're sitting right now, we could see we're in an area where we're in an area where a bookshelf is, and it's just volume of the making of Star Wars, the history of Star Wars, the visual effects of Star Wars. It's not just the action figures. There's a story of specifically this first movie that it never gets old. And there's so much to look at, to talk about, to reminisce about, to learn about. There's nothing like it. And StarLog was right there. I mean, we've said so many times before, this was our internet. And when there was a StarLog magazine with Star Wars on it, I was all over it.
Yeah, sorry, I laughed when you said the room that you're in. If it's like mine, I look in my the room I'm in is actually my Star Wars room. So there's posters and toys and everything from wall to wall. So definitely.
Wow, what a fantastic discussion this was, reminiscing about the history of Star Wars and how it affected our life. Lee, any closing words?
Man, it's always great going down memory lane, and really looking forward to the next one. I think that's Empire ups the ante, so to speak, and increases the bet quite a bit. So looking forward to that, and may the Force be with you.
I think this was just one of the best movies of all time, and the discussion was great, and it was fun to rewatch the movie and relive all of those great moments again.
So please, listeners, join us next time as we continue our countdown to Episode 9 with The Empire Strikes Back.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.